Welcome to Have More Babies. Today we're diving into a really significant topic in children's health, failure to thrive, or FTT.
That's right.
We'll be looking at what it actually means, how doctors identify it, and importantly, how it's managed.
And we're drawing on some really great insights today, specifically from Omega Pediatrics.
Yes, and behind those insights is a pediatrician with, what, over 20 years of experience?
Yeah, more than 2 decades working in all sorts of settings, developed countries, so a really broad perspective.
So our aim here is to give you a clear, useful understanding of FTT. It can sound worrying, but we want to break it down without being, overwhelming.
Exactly, and maybe the first thing to clarify is that failure to thrive itself, well, it isn't really a specific disease diagnosis.
Okay.
It's more like a warning sign, an alert. It tells us a child isn't growing the way we'd expect.
Like a check engine light for growth.
Precisely. It signals something needs a closer look, but doesn't immediately tell you the cause. We have to investigate.
Got it. So if it's an alert, what triggers it? What are those key indicators, those red flags we should be aware of?
Well, there are several benchmarks and patterns we track closely. For infants, a big one is weight gain. They should typically double their birth weight by about 4 months
4 months, okay.
and then triple it by their first birthday. If they're not hitting those milestones, that's definitely something we note.
Makes sense. What else?
We look very carefully at growth charts. Plotting weight and length over time is crucial.
Right, the percentile lines.
Exactly. So if a child's weight is consistently below the 5th percentile for their age, that's a concern.
Assuming they aren't just naturally small, right? You mentioned constitutional small stature.
Correct. We always consider that maybe they just come from a family of smaller people. But yeah, consistently below the 5th percentile for weight or for length warrants attention.
So it's about the trend, not just a single point.
Absolutely. That's key. Seeing a child cross 2 or more major weight percentile lines downwards on their chart, that's a really significant flag.
That shows a definite change in trajectory.
It does.
Yeah.
And another measure, based on some research, is if a child's weight is less than 75% of the median, the sort of middle point weight for their age. That's another indicator.
Okay, 75% of median, that's quite specific. Can you give us an example? Like what might this look like in practice?
Yeah, Omega Pediatrics shared a really good case. A 9-month-old baby, born perfectly average, right around the 50th percentile for weight.
Okay.
But by 9 months, their weight had dropped all the way down to the 3rd percentile.
Wow, that's a big drop.
Huge. And their length was higher, around the 10th percentile. So the weight had fallen much more dramatically than the length. That difference, that disproportionate growth, was a major warning sign.
That really paints a picture. And you mentioned the weight for length ratio earlier. How does that fit in?
Ah, yes. That's super important. It helps us adjust for those natural variations, family genetics, maybe racial differences in build.
So it gives a better sense of their nutritional status for their frame.
Exactly. It helps distinguish between a child who is truly underweight versus one who's just naturally petite, but otherwise healthy and proportionate.
Okay, so we've spotted some potential flags using these growth patterns. What happens next? How do you start figuring out the why? What's the diagnostic approach?
It always starts with a really thorough history and a careful physical exam. We need to gather all the clues.
Talking to the parents, obviously.
Absolutely. Asking detailed questions about the child's diet, what they eat, how much, how often, also how they eat. Are they fussy? Do they seem uncomfortable during meals? Feeding behaviors are key.
Right.
We also ask about medications, allergies, and importantly, the family circumstances, social factors, stress. These can play a role sometimes.
It sounds very comprehensive. What about the physical exam itself? Anything specific you look for related to growth?
Yes, and one thing Omega Pediatrics highlights is doing a basic dental check.
Dental, how does that connect?
Well, think about it. If a child has painful sores in their mouth or maybe damaged teeth, it could make eating really difficult or unpleasant.
Ah, I see. So it could directly impact their intake.
Precisely. It's something that might be easily overlooked, but can be significant.
That's a great point. And then I assume lab tests often come into play.
Yes, depending on what the history and exam suggest. We often start with some baseline labs.
Like what?
Things like a complete blood count, a CBC to check for anemia or signs of infection, a comprehensive metabolic panel that checks electrolytes, kidney, liver function, blood sugar.
Kind of a general health screen?
Sort of.
Yeah.
We'd also likely check thyroid function, screen for celiac disease that affects nutrient absorption, and maybe look at inflammatory markers. These help rule out or identify underlying medical issues.
Okay. And are there other more specific tests you might use?
Definitely. If infection is suspected, maybe a urine test or stool tests for pathogens. Depending on the whole clinical picture, tests for things like HIV or tuberculosis might be considered in some contexts.
And imaging, x-rays?
Sometimes. If we suspect a problem with the gut itself, how it's formed or how it's working, we might do radiographic studies, like imaging of the GI tract.
The source mentioned a specific case, a toddler with celiac disease.
Yes, a really good illustration. A 22-month-old girl. She had FTT, but also chronic diarrhea and a noticeably swollen tummy.
Ah, classic celiac symptoms almost.
Right. So they did the celiac screening. It came back positive. She started a strict gluten-free diet
Then her growth improved?
dramatically.
Yeah.
It highlights how identifying that underlying cause is crucial. And importantly, while the pediatrician might do the initial screen, they typically refer to a pediatric GI specialist for confirmation and ongoing management.
Right, specialist care. Okay, so once FTT is identified, maybe you have an idea of the cause. What's the game plan? What are the main management strategies?
It really boils down to two main things: getting enough calories in for catch-up growth and very consistent follow-up.
Catch-up growth, I like the sound of that. How do you boost the calories effectively?
Well, if the main issue seems to be just not getting enough calories, the general recommendation is aiming for about 150% of the usual daily calorie needs for their age and expected weight, not their current low weight.
150%, so quite a bit more.
Yes, to fuel that catch-up. And to figure out the specifics, using a 3-day food diary kept by the parents is really helpful.
To see what they're actually eating now.
Exactly. Then we can give targeted advice, maybe adding healthy fats or fortifying foods they already eat to increase the calorie density, making every bite pack more energy.
So it's about quality, not just quantity, making the food richer.
Precisely. And providing practical advice is key. Hands-on feeding tips, education about introducing nutrient-dense solids. Ideally, a dietitian is involved, but often the pediatrician provides this guidance directly.
And the follow-up, how often?
Very closely at first. Often weekly weight checks initially, just to make sure things are moving in the right direction. Then, as they start gaining well, we might space it out to monthly checks.
What about toddlers? Sometimes they hit picky phases or struggle moving to solids. Does FTT look different then?
It can be a common scenario. Difficulty transitioning to textured foods, for example. Strategies there might involve things like, say, adding some high-calorie cereal to purees or other foods they accept, just to boost the intake. And with those toddlers, sometimes just weekly checks and consistent encouragement and small dietary tweaks can lead to really impressive gains. We've seen kids climb back up the percentiles pretty quickly, sometimes within a couple of months.
That's encouraging. But what if it's a really severe case? Say, significant malnutrition or other issues?
In those more severe situations, yes, hospitalization might be needed for nutritional rehabilitation.
Okay.
Sometimes, especially if there's a severe aversion to eating by mouth, a child might need TPN, total parenteral nutrition. That's where nutrients go directly into the bloodstream via an IV.
Wow. Okay.
And in these complex cases, involving occupational therapists or speech therapists is often crucial. They can help with underlying feeding mechanics, oral motor skills, sensory issues around food.
It's clearly a multifaceted approach. Now, you touched on this earlier, but the source really emphasizes cultural considerations. Why is that so critical here?
Oh, it's absolutely vital. You simply can't create an effective care plan in a vacuum. You have to understand the family's context.
Their background, their beliefs.
Yes, their cultural background, values, traditions around food, their beliefs about health and illness. Understanding all that helps build trust. And trust is fundamental for adherence. If the family doesn't trust you or feel understood, the plan is less likely to succeed.
Can you share that example from Nigeria again? I thought that was really telling.
Right. The pediatrician working there noticed many families use traditional herbal remedies first.
Okay.
So instead of just dismissing that, they worked with the families, built trust, understood which practices were harmless or potentially helpful, which might be risky. They integrated the beneficial or neutral traditional aspects into the nutrition plans.
So it became collaborative, not just directive.
Exactly. And that collaboration led to much better buy-in and ultimately better outcomes for the kids. It's a powerful lesson about culturally sensitive care.
Definitely. Now, shifting slightly, the source also gave a more academic definition of FTT. Could you recap that?
Sure. Academically speaking, FTT is defined as inadequate physical growth, usually weight gain primarily. that causes a child's measurements to fall below the standard growth curves.
So basically not meeting the expected growth standards.
Pretty much. And while the reasons can be complex, as we've discussed, the fundamental issue is usually insufficient calorie intake or utilization, not enough fuel getting in or being used properly.
And the reasons for that lack of fuel can vary a lot, depending on where you are in the world, right?
Hugely. The pediatricians' experience really highlighted this. In sub-Saharan Africa, for instance, the primary drivers were often linked to poverty, food insecurity, lack of access to diverse foods, maybe limited nutritional knowledge.
So interventions focused on education and access.
Largely, yes, nutrition education, promoting affordable, calorie-dense foods. But then, in developed countries like the U.S., while social factors definitely still exist, you more often see underlying medical conditions causing FTT.
Like the ones you mentioned, heart defects, CF, celiac.
Exactly.
Hmm.
Chronic diseases, genetic disorders.
Hmm.
So the diagnostic approach might lean more heavily towards medical investigations in those settings, though you never ignore the social and environmental pieces.
It really shows FTT isn't one single thing, but rather a signpost pointing to potentially very different underlying issues.
That's a great way to put it.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what are the main takeaways for our listeners? The key things to remember?
I think number one is early recognition. Pay attention to those growth patterns. If you have concerns, get them checked out sooner rather than later. Timely evaluation makes a big difference.
Okay, early recognition.
Second, the core of management is optimized nutrition, getting those calories right, and consistent monitoring, keeping a close eye on progress.
Nutrition and monitoring, got it.
And third, always remember the importance of a thoughtful, individualized approach that considers the family's circumstances, their culture. That holistic view leads to the best outcomes.
So experience from all over the world really tells us that with early help and the right approach, these kids facing growth issues can absolutely get back on track.
They absolutely can. They can thrive.
Well, thank you so much for breaking all of that down for us. It's been incredibly insightful. For everyone listening, if you want more detailed information or resources on children's growth and well-being, please do check out omegapediatrics.com.
Yes, definitely worth a visit. And if you found this conversation helpful, we'd really appreciate it if you'd like this video. Subscribe to the channel for more discussions like this, and maybe share with friends, family, or colleagues who might benefit.
And finally, something to think about. Just how deeply interconnected physical growth, nutrition, and a child's overall development truly are, especially in those critical early years. Being observant, trusting your instincts, and seeking support when needed, it really matters.
Couldn't agree more. Goodbye for now.
Goodbye.